I've had senior executives hire me to help with their change management challenges, asking me, so when can we expect people to move on? As if there was a specific date when grief and loss about change stops. And then I've had leaders hire me to help them keep showing up authentically and effectively while also working through the deep loss they felt when a restructuring caused them to lose their role or team members or even identity as a meaning for why they were originally hired into their role. On one side, leaders asking when people will get over it and re-engage in their work. And on the other side, people trying to hide how they feel, asking why they can't move on or why they're so irritable and disengaged. And both sides stuck because nobody had named what was actually going on. I'm Dr. Mira Brancu, and what you're about to watch is the complete 3-part workplace grief series from the Hard Skills podcast, compiled into one episode. You can understand it fully, start to finish. These 3 episodes originally aired separately, and I'm bringing them together here because the framework only fully lands when you see all 3 parts in sequence. Part 1 is about recognition, understanding what workplace grief is, including ambiguous workplace grief, and how it shows up differently from everything else leaders need to tend to. And often this is mislabeled as other things. So what do leaders mislabel it as? Part 2 is about what not to do, the 3 well-meaning leadership responses that actually make things worse. And part 3 is the part that most people want to skip to, the practical framework, specific language, specific strategies, what grief-informed leadership actually looks like and sounds like in practice. And what I want you to know is, please don't skip to part 3. I mean it. If you don't understand what you're actually dealing with first, the strategies will not work, might not even make sense, because these strategies are only for addressing workplace grief. They won't address burnout, for example, which is another series I have that requires a whole different framework, even though it can easily be mistaken for the same thing. Burnout and grief sometimes both show up as disengagement, but they require different understanding and therefore different interventions. So grab what you need, a notebook, a coffee, a walk with a listening, and let's get into it. This one is going to really change how you lead people through loss, which is a skill all leaders need, especially right now. Have you ever had someone on your team say, "Something inside me died" after a big change happened at work? Or maybe you've been noticing your employees and leaders disengage, take more time off, becoming more cynical. It might be organizational grief and burnout. And knowing what it looks like could change how you lead others through change. Welcome to the Hard Skills. I'm Dr. Mira Brancu, and for the next few episodes, I'll take a deeper dive look at organizational change from a very different perspective. The prolonged, unresolved psychological grief that happens during restructures, layoffs, and major transitions, and why traditional change management completely misses how to appropriately address it. In our previous bonus series, we looked at burnout, which definitely can contribute. So in this series, I'll add another layer: organizational ambiguous grief in the workplace and what it looks like. I was initially inspired to think about ambiguous grief in Leslie Poston's Cyberspace podcast episode on sneaky grief and how we don't acknowledge certain kinds of grief in our society. I loved that episode. It made me think about all the leaders I work with now who have experienced the impact of restructuring, loss of programs they've stood up, including those that connect to their sense of purpose and identity, like DE&I programs, RIFs, and more. I wrote about it in my Psychology Today blog series in an article I called "When Workplace Upheaval Turns into Unresolved Grief," and people resonated so much with it, I decided to turn it into a 3-part podcast series to explain more about how to separate similar ideas like this and then what you could do about it. So let's take one example. Maya, who of course on all my podcast episodes is a composite of several clients to protect anonymity, okay? Maya is a mid-level leader in a global tech company. Her company restructured, and according to them, it was to streamline operations. But everyone could see what was really happening. They were quietly moving people out. For Maya, it was crystal clear that they were slowly pushing her out. And here's what made it more devastating. She had poured her heart and soul into this job. She had personally designed the entire strategy she hired to execute. When she reached out to me for help, her goal was straightforward. I want to show up authentically while demonstrating I can do this job. I want to show that I'm not affected by these changes, and I want to leave with my dignity. But I think about that impossible tension in that statement. How do you balance authenticity when you feel angry, shocked, confused, betrayed, and hurt? How do you demonstrate you're not affected when everything inside you is screaming that you are affected? And she told me something that really pulled at me. She said, something inside me died when I started losing the very things that brought me here, including the support I thought I had. I feel like I'm going through the motions in an organization I don't recognize anymore. That's not dramatic. That's not weak. That's grief. Yeah, grief. When companies restructure, merge, or betray employee trust, whether they realize it or not, entire workforces experience legitimate ambiguous grief. Your people have lost colleagues, culture, mission, security, and purpose. Yet they're expected to remain engaged with the very system that created their loss and to immediately just get back to work as if nothing happened. I mean, maybe it didn't impact the executive who isn't as close to it, of course, but organizations are made of people, and people have lots of feelings about lots of things, right? And loss is a feeling that cuts deep. And the people more likely to be affected by it are mid-level leaders who were previously highly engaged and committed to the organization. They had hopes and dreams about their next steps in the organization. They had made strategic plans and goals for new initiatives and improvements. They had invested lots of time to develop their teams, and the restructures, cut funding, and other upheaval have taken all that away from them, leaving them wondering, do I still belong here? Am I still valued? Did I just lose my entire career or life for this? So this isn't traditional grief. It's what Dr. Pauline Boss calls ambiguous grief. She coined this term, ambiguous grief, which is a prolonged, unresolved freezing of the grief process. You're mourning the death of something while still having to show up for it. No funeral, no closure, just an open-ended, unresolved loss. And unlike traditional grief, where you get closure, ambiguous grief creates chronic sorrow, feelings of helplessness, and degradation of people's usual coping mechanisms. And if you have women leaders on your team, leaders from marginalized backgrounds, they're probably carrying an extra burden if they have been experiencing the glass cliff phenomenon. What is the glass cliff phenomenon? Well, women are more likely to be promoted to leadership roles during times of crisis after everything else has been tried. They get handed the most challenging positions right when things are falling apart. Then they're expected to manage both the practical changes and the invisible emotional labor of caring for employees with constant compassion. And when things go wrong under such impossible conditions, women are judged more harshly than their male counterparts, but they're still expected to show up with empathy and compassion. So client Maya wasn't just dealing with loss and losing her job and her vision. She was also dealing with the weight of having been set up to manage an impossible situation and now being blamed when it didn't work out. So here's the real cost to your organization. When you don't acknowledge grief, you mislabel it. You call people resistant to change or disengaged or difficult. You make it about them being the problem of not accepting the change instead of acknowledging their very human experience. So let me tease apart what you're actually seeing, because these terms get used interchangeably when they really shouldn't be. And I'm going to describe the differences between organizational trauma or betrayal, ambiguous grief, disengagement, low morale, change resistance, job hugging, quiet quitting, absenteeism, and more. These terms are being thrown around, but some of these are symptoms, some are root causes, and some are behaviors. And when you know where they're coming from, right? What's the root cause? What's the behavior that comes after the root cause? You're going to have a better sense of what can help. So let's start with organizational trauma or betrayal. Dr. Jennifer Freyd coined this term. Institutional betrayal is what she called it. So that's an example of organizational trauma. This kind of trauma or betrayal is a root cause. And Dr. Freyd describes it as when your institution violates trust by failing to fulfill obligations to people who depend on it. Think about layoffs without warning, broken promises about job security, leadership lying about the direction of the company. So that experience leads to a variety of reactions and counteractions. The rest of the terms that I'm going to describe are all responses. Some are emotional, some are behavioral, but the responses to this organizational betrayal or trauma. So we're going to start with ambiguous grief, right? That I just mentioned is the emotional response to that kind of trauma. It's what people feel when they've lost something but can't fully process it because they're still in the environment. It's that something inside me died response, or I feel like I lost a part of myself feeling. Now, here's where it gets confusing. When people are grieving, it shows up differently. If you think about the typical Kubler-Ross model of grieving, right? We know that the typical responses to grief might include anger, bargaining, and depression before we get to acceptance. But organizational behavior shows up differently. People are going to be like bargaining, right, to get their jobs back in the same way. And it might not show up as depression in the same way. It might look like several things. Disengagement is when people psychologically withdraw. They stop contributing ideas. They stop going above and beyond. They do the bare minimum. And from an HR perspective, you see declining engagement scores. But disengagement is a symptom. It could be from grief. It could be from burnout. It could be from poor management. It could be from lack of growth opportunities. So that's what disengagement is. It is a symptom of any of those things. Let's move on to quiet quitting. I see this more recent term as just describing people who set boundaries and refuse to go above and beyond. Some people call that disengagement. I think it's often people preserving their peace and limiting how much stress they allow into their lives related to work. Sometimes it's a healthy response to an unhealthy system. Sometimes it's grief showing up as self-protection. Okay, let's move on to low morale. Low morale is the collective emotional state when the whole team or organization feels demoralized, pessimistic, defeated. We call that low morale. Again, it's a symptom. You can have low morale for many causes, and unacknowledged grief is definitely one of them. But low morale is often kind of applied to a response across people, like within a team or group or organization. Okay, let's move on to change resistance. Change resistance is often what leaders label when people aren't enthusiastically embracing new initiatives. And maybe they're even working against it, like sabotaging or undermining the process or procrastinating implementation. It's definitely a behavioral response, right? Some of the other ones were emotional responses. This is a behavioral response, but it's not the root cause of a problem. And so sometimes what looks like resistance is actually grief. People aren't resisting the future, they are mourning the past. There's a big difference, and it requires a completely different response. I can't tell you how many times I've heard complaints from employees that they feel like leaders keep telling them it's time to move on, when the leaders never took the time to even acknowledge harm was done in the past, and that still lingers. We even see this as a nation, right? Okay, so change resistance, we want to be very careful about this one because we often see this as a root cause and target it instead of what's behind the change resistance, which is what causes change management processes and interventions to fail if you ignore or overlook or don't catch the root cause behind the change resistance and just call people resistant to change, right? Okay, let's look at a few more terms. Job hugging, or another term that has been used similar to job hugging is resenteeism, which is a combination of absenteeism and resentment. It's kind of like a behavior when people cling to roles or jobs they don't love anymore or even resent being in out of survival. They can't go anywhere else. They want to go, but they can't. And you see this after rounds of layoffs. People won't speak up. They won't take risks. They won't advocate for themselves. They're worried because they are in survival mode. And I might call these silent grievers. You probably won't see many of the symptoms on the outside, though you might feel a lack of passion and energy around their work, right? Or how they engage in their work. So, final interesting one is presenteeism. Presenteeism is a behavior when people work when they're not well, like when they're dealing with physical pain, mental health issues, or burnout. Many of us work through that, right? And unfortunately, it can impair job performance and satisfaction. It can affect focus, it can affect recovery, and it could lead to more problems like absenteeism, not showing up for work, calling in sick for longer periods of time, taking a lot more FMLA. We are seeing more and more of that. It's a cascading effect. And sometimes it's just that people just keep showing up, but they really don't know how else to take care of themselves, right? So why do these differences matter? Because when you mislabel what's happening, you implement the wrong solutions. You bring in change management consultants to address resistance when people are actually grieving. You launch engagement initiatives to fix low morale when people are experiencing institutional betrayal. You try to manage quiet quitters as a performance problem when they're actually protecting themselves from a toxic system or from chronic burnout. So none of those interventions work when people are actually grieving or experiencing a traumatic response or burned out, right? It actually makes things worse because it signals that leadership fundamentally doesn't get it. Now, there is some really good material out there already about putting in place trauma-informed workplace cultures, psychological safety measures, trust-building measures, right? These are important. So these approaches don't fully address unresolved grief. For example, you can create all the psychological safety in the world, but if people are grieving and no one acknowledges it, that grief doesn't go away, it goes underground. So here's what I want you to sit down with this week. Here are some reflection questions for you, okay? Number one, what, if anything, have your teams lost in recent organizational changes? Okay. Number two, what's still physically present but fundamentally changed at work? Okay. And number three, more importantly, what grief might be hiding under labels like resistance, disengagement, low morale, or quiet quitting. As always, if you would like to work with me as a coach, team or organizational consultant, or workshop facilitator around these issues to help you manage these issues, definitely set up a free consultation call to learn more about my services and see if I can help. You can find out more at www.gotowerscope.com and click on the big button, top right, if you're looking at a browser, that says free consultation. Okay, I would love to chat with you more about it and see if I can help. We are diving into the 3 leadership mistakes that make workplace grief worse. That's part 2 of this series. And you've probably made all 3 at some time in your life if you've been a leader for a while, and with the best of intentions. So stay tuned if you want to find out what those 3 mistakes are and how to catch yourself from doing it again, and what to do instead. You're trying to move your team forward. You're staying positive. You're avoiding difficult conversations because you don't want to get dwelling on the negative. So why is your team getting more cynical, not less? The 3 well-intentioned leadership responses that actually prolong grief and erode trust. Let me take you back to Maya's story. Her organization didn't just fail to prepare her for the loss she might experience, if you recalled from part 1 of this series. They expected her to sell these changes to her team. She wasn't on board. She wasn't thrilled with it, but she still had to sell it to her team. Think about that position. She's grieving the loss of her vision, her security, her sense of belonging, her position, her people, and simultaneously, she's supposed to be the cheerleader for the very changes that are destroying what she built. This created friction between her and her team members. So now she didn't trust her organization, and her team was starting to distrust her as if it was her idea, as if she was in on it, as if she had lied to them or not been transparent about what was going to happen. It is a lose-lose for middle managers who are supposed to connect employees to organizations. Now, most people would call this poor change management, but here's the thing that I want you to understand. Even strong change management would have failed here. You could have perfect executive sponsorship with visibility and presence, crystal clear, beautifully aligned communication, and it still wouldn't work. Because you can't just communicate the why about upcoming changes without acknowledging real loss. The six essential questions that are typical within change management, especially if you use a like pro-sci change management perspective, for example, questions like, why is this change happening now? What is the risk of not changing? What are the benefits of supporting this change? All of those questions help leaders frame what to expect with the change, but they don't guide leaders about how to handle the emotional experience and impact. And being responsive to the emotional experience and impact requires self awareness and emotional intelligence to pick up the cues of what people need and then meet them where they are, offering to them what they need, which is not always about the future. I've observed three very common executive responses that intensify ambiguous grief. And what's tricky is that they all feel reasonable in the moment, but they're just missing the mark and the right timing. There's also one more challenge to these that make them really hard to spot in yourself, but I'm going to talk about that later after I describe these three common responses. The first one, the minimizer. The person who says, it's just business. We need to move on from the past. It's just business. That drives me crazy. The minimizer wants to fast forward through uncomfortable feelings, or they assume because they're over it, everyone else should be over it, which is very much a self awareness and emotional intelligence issue. When they come to me, they ask me, how do we get employees to get over it? Without appreciating that grief is a prolonged process, which doesn't have like an on and off switch you can just flip. So when they hire to help me with their change management challenges, they're the ones asking me, when can we expect people to move on? And unfortunately, there isn't a tidy timeline. And, you really can't just let people grieve indefinitely, of course, but there is a different way to attend to it that's understanding and responsive. Because people don't just stop grieving just because you're uncomfortable with it, or you show no interest in engaging with them about it, or it's not coming up for you. They just stop showing it at work. And then it becomes hidden grief, which manifests as disengagement, cynicism, lower productivity, and eventually attrition. They leave, right? If you're noticing that happening, you might need to attend to that. The second type, the false optimist. The false optimist says things like, this change is going to be great for everyone. Sometimes change is ultimately positive, but the false optimist refuses to acknowledge that even positive changes involve loss. In our personal lives, moving to a new home means leaving the home you and your kids grew up in, or leaving your neighbors who became friends. At work, when you get promoted, you might lose peer relationships and the daily work that you loved. When your company gets acquired with promises of great resources, you might lose your scrappy culture and autonomy. And when leaders refuse to acknowledge losses, employees feel dismissed and isolated in their feeling. They think, is something wrong with me for not being excited? And this might even create shame around normal grief responses, which drives people again to hide their real feelings and show up with a fake smile. And that's exhausting and it's unsustainable, and it also affects productivity. The last one, the third, is the conflict avoider. Some leaders retreat from difficult conversations entirely. They're so uncomfortable with emotion that they disappear when people need them most. Or they're personally overwhelmed with the upcoming changes themselves, or the idea of having to be there for so many people that they cancel one on ones, they send emails instead of having conversations, they delegate the hard stuff to HR or middle managers, they cancel team meetings, and the silence speaks volumes. It says, your pain doesn't matter enough for me to sit with you in it. And then here's what happens that's even worse. In the absence of information, employees are going to fill the vacuum with their own narratives. And those narratives are almost always worse than the reality and inaccurate. Employees are going to start saying things like, leadership doesn't care about us. They're hiding something even worse that's coming. They know this was a mistake, but they won't admit it. Those are probably inaccurate in most situations, but if you don't show up, that's the information that's going to be going around. So, why do smart, caring leaders default to these responses? I will tell you, I have defaulted to these responses in the past myself. I'm not proud of it, but I just didn't realize, right? I was doing it. So we all can easily fall trap to these. So a few reasons why we do it. First, we've been trained that leadership means having answers, staying positive, staying and looking strong for others, or moving forward. We've been told that dwelling on the past is unproductive, that emotions need to be managed and contained. So from the perspective of our training as leaders, ambiguous grief requires us to shift to a different mindset, one that accepts and acknowledges there are no easy answers. Second, in addition to how we're trained as leaders, there's also our own field of expertise in that training. And some of us have training that specifically teaches us how to minimize, ignore, or overlook crises specifically so that we can manage them well in the short term and protect ourselves. These include people like first responders, like police officers and firefighters, as well as ER doctors and most of the healthcare field. I remember in my own leadership journey that I had to ask my team to please alert me when I should be paying attention to something they felt was an urgent issue or a crisis, because I had training in suicide intervention. And after that training, working with suicidal patients, very little else felt like a concern to focus on. So if you work with lots of trauma exposure, for example, it's the same thing. You become kind of numb, or you focus on only the most extreme cases and things don't bubble up to the top. You can easily fall trap to any of these responses: minimizer, false optimist, or conflict avoider. And grief that's acknowledged and supported moves people through it. Grief that's minimized, dismissed, or avoided gets people stuck in it. It goes underground. It manifests as all the dysfunctional behaviors you're trying to eliminate. You're not choosing between addressed grief and moving forward. You're choosing between addressed grief now so you can move forward efficiently and effectively, versus ignoring grief now and staying stuck while pretending to move forward. So this week, I want you to notice which of these three responses you default to when you're uncomfortable. And I want you to think about a couple of questions. What would it cost you to sit with someone's grief instead of trying to fix it? Where in your organization is grief hiding under other labels? What would it look like to work with grief, work through it, instead of minimize or ignoring it to try to force a moving on? And as always, if you'd like to work with me as a coach, team or organizational consultant, or workshop facilitators to help you manage these issues, set up a free consultation call to learn more about my services and see if I could help. You can find out more at www.gotowerscope.com and click on the big button that says free consultation. We're introducing a different framework, a grief-informed leadership framework. I'm going to give you specific language, concrete strategies, and real examples of what it looks like to lead with both compassion and clarity during organizational trauma responses. Because organizations that do this well, they don't just survive change. They build deeper, more resilient cultures, which ultimately yields greater productivity and profits through an engaged workforce. Your team is grieving. You know it by now. You've been listening to this 3-part series on ambiguous grief. But what do you actually say? How do you acknowledge loss without making it worse? How do you build trust when everything feels broken? In part 1, we introduced ambiguous grief and how the changes within organizations create legitimate loss. In part 2, we exposed the 3 problematic responses: minimizing, false optimization, and conflict avoidance. And today, we're talking about how to apply grief-informed leadership, the practical framework for leading through loss. This is the final part of my organizational grief series. What if we approached organizational change the way that we approach other forms of loss, with acknowledgement,
compassion, and realistic healing expectations. I mean, think about personal grief. When someone loses a family member, we don't say, "It's been 2 weeks, time to move on." We don't insist, "This is actually great because now you'll have more time to focus on yourself." We don't avoid them because their sadness makes us uncomfortable. Well, okay, some of you do avoid, but you know it's not a great thing to do. So we acknowledge the loss. We sit with them. We give them time and space and grace. So why do we expect organizational grief to work differently? Research shows that ambiguous grief requires different healing approaches. With traditional grief, you eventually get closure. But with ambiguous grief, closure is hard to access when the source of the loss remains present, as we've been talking about, right? So healing focuses on 3 things instead: meaning making, accepting the changed relationship, and fostering connection. And here's what it looks like in practice at work. First, name it to tame it. Acknowledge loss explicitly. Name what's being lost. Don't minimize it. Don't gloss over it. You can say things like, "We're losing people who have been here for years and who many of you consider friends," or "This restructure means that some of you will lose autonomy you've had," or "I know this acquisition feels like losing our identity." Yes, literally name what people are experiencing. We call that name it to tame it. You don't have to use the word grief if it doesn't feel natural. Just use their language. Loss, uncertainty, disruption, but name it directly because it's there anyway. People know it's there. By not naming it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? Okay, second, be the emotional container. Create space for processing. So what that means is hold discussions where people can share what they're grieving. This isn't wallowing. It's necessary people work. You might say, "I want to open space for us to talk about what we're losing in this transition." Or, "What are you going to miss most about how things were?" Or, "What feels hardest about this change for you?" Or, "What do you feel like you're being asked to let go of and that you wish you weren't, that wasn't the case? And how are you making sense of that?" And then, this is crucial, you listen. You don't fix, you don't problem solve, you don't offer silver linings, no toxic positivity here. You definitely don't persuade them to feel or think differently about it. You offer a grounded presence to just capture the experience. And I call that serving as an emotional container, right? You're just holding the emotions that are present. Many leaders don't realize how important this part of their job is, to be an emotional container. An emotional container offers a contained space to hold the emotions so it doesn't spill out everywhere. So some leaders worry, won't this make things worse? No, what keeps people stuck is unexpressed grief that has nowhere to go, so it gets spilled everywhere in different forms than how it started. Expressing it naturally just helps it move through. Okay, third, focus on meaning and purpose, not closure. You can't offer closure when the situation is ongoing, but you can offer a new shape to the experience by helping employees reconnect to a deeper purpose or a new meaning for it all. Many people experience this when they experience post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth often coexists with the struggle itself, but it allows for a new appreciation for relationships, inner strength building, new possibilities in other areas. Having time to reflect on the experience is what helps that growth. And you can start accessing it through questions like, what first drew you to this work that we're doing? Or when you think about why our work matters, what comes to mind? Or how can we honor what we're losing while recreating what's next? Help people find threads of continuity. What values remain even through the structured change? What mission persists even though the team looks different? Okay, fourth, model vulnerable leadership. Share your struggles with the situation, not in a way that burdens your team with your emotions, nor in a way that makes it about you or that it's minimizing their experiences, but simply in a way that gives permission for others to feel like they can share openly as well. So you might say, "I'm struggling with this too. I miss how things were." Or, "I don't have all the answers and that's really uncomfortable for me." Or, "I'm working to make sense of it just like you are." Authenticity creates psychological safety. When leaders admit they're human, they have had the same thoughts, everyone else gets permission to be human too. Here's what it might sound like if you put all of this together. So imagine that maybe you're addressing your team after layoffs. Here's what you might say that puts all of these ideas together. We're at a major turning point. We've lost funding, which makes it feel like walking on a tightrope. I'm not going to convince you that these layoffs are a good thing. It stinks that we're in this situation. And I know that this represents real loss. You're losing colleagues, people you work closely with, maybe even consider friends. You're losing ways of working that felt comfortable and perhaps a vision of what this company could be. I see that loss. I sense it too. I feel it too. I'm not going to ask you to pretend you don't. At the same time, our work is still critically important. Our customers count on us to show up every day. The work we do matters, and that hasn't changed. There's only one way we're going to weather this together, and that's supporting each other. We're going to acknowledge grief when it surfaces. We're going to provide space to process it and support each other through it. And rather than just pretending it's business, we will acknowledge it. So over the next few weeks, I'll be scheduling conversations where we can talk openly about what this means. And I'm not going to have all the answers, but I will try to show up honestly, and I hope you will too. So, remember Maya from episode 1? Here's how her story ended when her boss did something like this. Once her boss stopped trying to pretend the team wasn't affected, the team started having real conversations. They acknowledged the losses they were all experiencing. They saw each other more authentically. Dignity and relationships were preserved. And with a team that felt like their leader could show up for them, which rebuilt some trust. The future of organizational leadership isn't about eliminating difficult emotions. It's about developing the emotional intelligence to guide people through these difficult, challenging situations with wisdom, compassion, and authenticity. Organizations that can do grief-informed leadership well build deeper trust. Employees smell dishonesty and platitudes from a mile away, but they can also become deeply invested when they feel emotionally and psychologically supported through honest, vulnerable responses. So this week, reflect. What would it mean for your leadership to embrace grief-informed practices? What would it mean for you in your leadership? What's one conversation you've been avoiding that needs to happen? How might acknowledging loss actually accelerate your team's healing and performance? If you've been facing these challenges in your organization and want support, I work with leaders and teams on exactly these kinds of transitions, and you can find out more about my coaching, my consulting, and workshop facilitation at towerscope.com. And you can click on the button that says free consultation if you want to talk through it with me a little bit further to see if there's a way that I can support you with this. But this closes out our organizational grief series. I hope that it was useful. I'm Dr. Mira Brancu, and this is The Hard Skills.